Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. We missed last week, so just to recap the topic is what they call in English the right of first refusal. In Talmudic language, it's called the law of the neighbor, bar mitzvah, the one sitting on the border, which is the neighbor. And the principle, the big idea, which we have to develop and ultimately we have to limit. The big idea is that if I'm a neighbor and a piece of land is for sale and a stranger wants to come, in other words, someone who doesn't live in the neighborhood wants to come and buy this land, I as a neighbor have a right to say, look, the seller doesn't really care who he sells to. For me, it's a benefit to have all my fields together, because if I have to plow the field, if I have to plow 1 acre here, 1 acre 10 miles away, another acre 30 miles away, then that would be a great cost for me and a harm for me. So we say, look, the buyer, what do you care where you buy land? But for the neighbor, it's very significant if he can get his hand on that piece of land, and therefore, in certain circumstances, he can pay the buyer, reimburse the buyer, and take the land. Now, there are so many different limitations to this law, as we will see, but I just wanted to be clear and differentiate this from the American system. In the American system, there is only a right of first refusal if you give your neighbor that right, if you commit to tell your neighbor in writing that you will sell to them first. But in America, if I don't tell my neighbor that he will have the right to buy my land first, then my neighbor does not have that right. Sometimes it's actually in the deed. Sometimes in the deed, there's a right of first refusal, but it has to be by agreement, right? The owner of the land has to sort of give that right to other people, to the neighbors. In this Talmudic system, when that law applies, when the law of the right of first refusal, when the law of the neighbor applies, it applies even if the owner of the seller, in other words, the seller never gave that right to the neighbor. The neighbor has an inherent right, and the question is if it's a right and how to define it. That is part of the discussion about the scope of the law. But in that sense, it is very different than the American law. So that's introduction number one. Introduction number two is that the way Maimonides develops this quote unquote right, even though I guess we can call it a right. Yes, I don't know. You can't call it a right. You'll see later why we're not going to call it a right. We'll call it the law or the custom. But the way it develops in stages. And there were basically 3 stages. And the first one is probably easiest to accept. The second one is a little bit harder. And the third one is the broader right, which I'm sure some people will be uncomfortable with it, but it's good to discuss it anyway. So what are the 3 stages that I'm talking about? So the first one is what we discussed the first 2 weeks ago when we started chapter 12. And the first one is basically, if I'm getting this right, we have 2 brothers or multiple brothers or multiple siblings or multiple relatives, doesn't matter. And we're all inheriting a piece of land. So it's not like you have more connection to one side of the land than I have a land. We have 5 brothers, grandfather died, we're dividing the land. One brother says, if you're dividing the land, why don't you give me the portion of this land that's next to my field so I could have both my fields together, right? And that was the law that we said under certain circumstances, if all the land is equal, if all parts are equal, we discuss what happens if the parts are not equal. But assuming all parts are equal, we say, look, all the brothers here are equal partners. It's not like one brother is more connected to one parcel of land than the other brother, right? So if you're dividing the land anyway, it doesn't cause any harm. Why don't you give the brother who's a neighbor, give him his section in the field he's inheriting next to his own field, so both the fields will be together. That's, I think, the easiest to accept of the following steps. And that is called the law. They call it, basically the idea is we enforce against the law of Sodom. As we mentioned last week, Sodom is the mentality. Sodom was the wicked city in biblical times that was destroyed. They outlawed charity. Sodom is the mentality, is that I don't want you to gain, even if it doesn't cost me anything, right? So if I'm not going to lose anything, but I oppose your gaining, that's considered, in Talmud, we can't handle that. It's called zen heneh. One person benefits, the other person doesn't lose. So if I insist that you should not gain, even if it's not going to cost me anything, that's considered. I don't know. We're uncomfortable with that. So in that case, we say, you know what? All the brothers, it makes no difference which part you get. For the other brother, it makes no difference. If all parts are the same, it makes no difference. But there's one brother that will benefit from having both fields together, and you have to specifically not separate his lands. What do you care? We enforce and we say, you can have both your lands together. Reminds me of the joke. The joke is like this. Once upon a time, a guy comes to the rabbi and he slaughtered his animal. Animal cost $1,000. And he asked the rabbi, there's a problem with the lungs. It wasn't sure if it was kosher. Comes to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, look, I'm sorry to tell you, your animal's not kosher. Now, the value of kosher meat is expensive, so he just lost $500. Okay, he goes home, he doesn't care. The next day, the same guy, the butcher, comes to the rabbi. He says, look, we have a court case with my neighbor. What are we fighting about? We're fighting about $5. So the rabbi thinks and investigates, and finally rules that not the butcher. The butcher is wrong. The butcher has to pay his neighbor $5. The butcher gets so upset. He's not shouting at the rabbi. He says, you have no idea how to study Talmud. You better go back to school. You don't know anything about the law. Why are you a rabbi in this town? We should drive you out of town. So the rabbi says, I don't understand. Yesterday, I told you that the cow was not kosher, and you took a loss of $500, and you didn't say a word. Now, for $5, you're creating this whole tumult. So the butcher says, look, I don't care to lose $500. I just don't want my neighbor to make $5. Right? So that's the difference, and that's human nature, and that's perhaps what the Talmud is uncomfortable with. So that is, like I said, I think that case is easier to swallow for people who like open markets and don't like regulation. But I think that's relatively speaking easier to swallow. Then we move to the cases that become a little bit more difficult to swallow. And what is that? The next case, the intermediary case, here's the case. So we all, and this is a sort of philosophical because it thinks about how inheritance works. You have four brothers, doesn't matter. We have a few people who are partners in this land, who we inherited together. And we're all partners, it's wonderful. And we trust each other. One day I plow, the next day you plow. We're a group, we're partners. One of the partners wants to sell his share to a stranger. So now the brothers say, 1 second, if you're selling your share to a stranger, you're going to bring a stranger amongst us, and we're all partners. We're all treating ourselves as partners. We don't want a stranger amongst our partnership. So you know what? You want to sell out? No problem. Sell to us. We'll buy you out. And that's the next step. The next step is that's sort of the second case, broadening the scope of the law of the neighbor, is the partners say, look, we're your neighbor. We don't want a foreigner coming in amongst us because we treat this as a partnership. And therefore, we'll buy you out, but we don't want to give you the right to sell to other people. And the Talmud, again, there's a debate. Again, the ruling is, the halachic ruling is that the brothers, the partners, could enforce and say, you can't bring a stranger amongst our partnership. But again, that's easier than the final case, which we're about to say, because the final case expands this much further. And then once it's expanded, then we're going to spend the next 2 chapters once again limiting it and saying where it does apply and where it doesn't apply, etc. But you see the steps. Number 1 is nobody has any connection to this piece of land more than the next guy. You have a bunch of brothers inheriting a land together. One of the brothers is a neighbor to the father's property, and he says, look, we're dividing now, assuming all parcels are the same. Give me my parcel next to my field. Why not? Why would someone else have more of a right to that parcel than he does? That's the easiest. The next step is, no, it was already divided. We're partners in the sense we all inherited a field together, but each guy sort of has his share. And now I'm selling my share. I want to sell it to a stranger. The brothers say, look, instead of selling it to a stranger, we want to buy it from you. That's the next case. And finally, we get to the most quote unquote radical case, which we'll get to in a minute. But in the meantime, let's read the second step. I'll open up Maimonides and I'm going to skip. After we said point number 1 in section 1, we have different details about that in section 2, section 3. Well, that's sort of just details. Maybe we'll get back to it later. I want to go to the next stage. The next stage will be 4 is the second step of the law, and 5 is the third step, which is sort of the most expansive. And like I said, after that we have to, we'll start limiting it again. So let's read number 4. When one of a group of brothers or partners sells his portion to another individual, right? So in other words, it's a group of brothers, but what does it mean that they're brothers? It doesn't matter that they're brothers. It matters if they were brothers in that culture, it means they all inherited the land together from their father, right? So at some point, the land, they each have a connection to this land, right? Because brothers inheriting are essentially partners. And if they then decide to divide, it's like partners dividing, right? So that's what you have here. You have one other group of brothers or partners. Partners is the same story. 3 people come in, buy a land together. They're really sort of all inherently connected to all parts of the land, right? Now, one of these brothers or partners sells his portion to another individual. The other brothers or partners may remove that individual from his purchase. They could say buyer, you have to leave. We'll reimburse you. Whatever you paid, we give you your money, go home. We're not allowing you to come amongst us. They must pay him the price he paid, but he must depart. The privilege was granted to prevent a foreign party from entering among them, right? You have a certain level of comfort with the people who you're sharing the field with, right? So if you're bringing a stranger into your life, into your land, you have the right to refuse that person from coming in. Of course, you have to be willing to write the check and reimburse the guy the money, right? Because we don't want this guy who's selling to lose, right? We also have to balance, as we will see later, part of this is we're going to have to balance the rights of the seller. So you make it too difficult for a foreign buyer, you're really limiting the seller's options. So we're going to have to deal with that. But part of the issue here is that it's interesting. The seller can sell whoever he wants. The seller can sell. The buyer can buy. But once the buyer buys, you'll see it's a very small window. But the brothers could say, "Take your money and have a nice day." But they have to give him the money. They have to give the buyer the money. So that is the second step. And now we get to the third step. Now we get to the third step. What's the third step? The third step is number 5. Okay, I don't know who translates this. V'lo oid. V'lo oid means not only this, but more. Right? We're taking this a step further. This is not the limit of the principle. Even when a person sells property which he owns, it means land. Even when a person sells property, real property, when he owns to another person, his colleague, the owner of the property neighboring his, has the right to pay the purchase price to the buyer and remove him from his purchase. The purchaser who comes from afar is considered an agent of the neighbor. So we'll leave that sentence for us for a moment, but before we even get to the last sentence, the idea here is if somebody else is going to enter and buy my neighboring land, I could tell that neighbor, I can give him the money and send him away, and I could buy that land, and for the same price that the neighbor have to reimburse the buyer, the foreign buyer, with whatever he paid. And then there's a technical issue which will have ramifications later. The buyer who bought it is considered like my agent. So it's like, yeah, you bought the land from my neighbor, but you're like my agent. So now I can reimburse you and I can get the land. So that's a technicality which we'll get to later. But this is the sort of the essence of the law. We have to still explain it and still debate it. And then, as we will see, we have 2 chapters limiting it, but that's the big idea. Off the record,
Well, I didn't quite understand why do we need that buyer if the right of first refusal is still in place? Why? Just to find out the market price?
Why do we need the buyer? That is a good question. That is a very good question. It's not just, it's basically to trigger the sale. Let's say I'm a neighbor. Let's say I'm a neighbor. You want to sell. I'm your neighbor. You want to sell. You want to sell, and I'm the neighbor. I'm in no rush. I'm not desperate to buy. In other words, I want that land, right? But I have no incentive. You come to me and say, I want to sell the land. I have no incentive to run to the bank, to pull out my savings and give you the cash, right? So I say, you come to me and say, I want to sell my land. I say, okay, you could sell your land. We'll see later what that means if I say it, but I'm not rushing. When you have a buyer, you put it on the market, you're forcing the sale. And you'll see later, I have a very small window. The neighbor has a very small window. He can't say, oh, I'm going to get a mortgage. No, you have a very small window. You have to show up. If you want to stop the sale, you have to show up to the court with the cash, right? So basically to force movement. That's what I would say. That's what I would say. Now I want to say two more points. One more point I want to say is as follows. What's the logic here? The logic here is that one way to explain it is, the issue here is that if you're talking about a field, you could, for the buyer, you're buying an acre of land. It doesn't matter where you buy your acre of land, or it's less important. For me, I'm the neighbor. If I have to plow two separate fields, that is very significant, a very significant burden upon me. The question will become, and we'll get to that later, is, does this apply to homes? And that's not explained in the Talmud. The Talmud does not refer to homes. The Talmud refers to land meant for agriculture. And therefore, there's a post-Talmudic debate of what the story with homes are. And it's not exactly clear what Maimonides' position is. But the argument against saying that applies to homes would be that every home is different. There's two arguments, really two arguments. One argument would be that every home is different. So you can't say, okay, don't buy my home. When I'm with the field, I'm the neighbor. I say, look, my friend, you're going to plow a field, you're growing potatoes. It makes no difference where you grow potatoes, this acre or the next acre. It doesn't bother you where you grow potatoes, right? So why don't you go elsewhere? With a home, you can't really say that because every home is different. Every home is unique. So you can't replicate, you can't buy a similar home. So that's an argument to say it doesn't apply to homes. Another argument to say it doesn't apply to homes is that when it comes to homes, okay, we'll see. There's some technical arguments, but besides for the technical arguments, there's also the point here that when it comes to agriculture, we're both in the business of trying to expand our assets, and therefore, it's justified that I want to expand my assets. But when it comes to a home, having a home next door to mine does not really allow. I'm not going to live in both places, right? Even if I want to go construction, it's not so clear that you could make a construction to combine the properties if that would trigger the right, because you're not considered neighbors, so to speak. You'll see. I'm going ahead, but we'll see later. Now, let's say I'm a neighbor. Let me just, okay, I'll go back for a second. Let's say I'm a neighbor. My land neighbors your land, but in between there is a stone wall or a stone mountain. In other words, there's stone, there's rock that cannot be plowed. So here we don't say, I don't have the right to first refusal. I can't say I'm going to buy my neighbor's land. And you know what? I'm going to excavate the stone and I'll combine both properties and it will be easier. We say no, because that requires construction. If it requires construction, you're not really neighbors. It's one of the ways of limiting it, right? So it only applies to people who have to a case where you have two fields touching each other. They both could be plowed instantaneously, immediately, right? Then you consider neighbors. So in that case, the argument would be it doesn't apply to a home because a home, to make that one home, is going to require a construction. Well, you can't become the neighbor by creating a construction, by construction, so to speak. So I'm just trying to say that at this point, it's still the issue of at this point, it's still the issue of we're talking about what's clear is we're talking about agricultural land. And the argument would be, if you're going to grow potatoes, it really makes no difference for you where you're going to grow the potatoes. For me, it's very significant that I have both my fields together next to each other. And if I have to plow two places, yeah, I know you also, if you have to travel another few miles, that's going to cost you money, but it's not as much as me having to plow in two separate places and to bring employees to two separate places. That's considered a great burden, and therefore it's based on a biblical verse that we're going to see in number 5 that Maimonides quotes, even though he doesn't always quote the biblical sources, and that is, let's try to do what's just. Let's try to do what's right. In other words, let's go beyond the letter of the law, even though legally I don't really have a right to my neighbor's land, but let's go beyond the letter of the law and help the neighbor because it's considered good public policy. That's one introduction. One more introduction before I want some pushback, because we have to have some disagreement. Otherwise, it's not really a Talmud class. One more introduction is as follows. When I first learned this, or when I first taught this, I get a lot of pushback. The pushback I get is you're harming the seller. Why are you harming the seller? Because if you're harming the seller, if you say that the neighbor can always have the right of first refusal, you're limiting the pool of buyers, right? Why would a buyer go through the trouble of coming and offering money if he says, I'm going to be bought out by the neighbor? So you're giving the neighbor more power than the seller, and therefore you're weakening the position of the seller and how much money he can get for his assets. That is the critique that I received when I first started teaching this piece of Talmud. Now, since I'm not an economist, I don't really have a good answer for this, but I do have a theory that we have to run by the economists. So I'm still in the process. The theory would be that, yes, you're right. In some sense, it is harming the seller. And therefore, we'll see later, there are a lot of instances where the seller is being harmed too much. And then we nullify this law. We say it doesn't apply in all cases because we want to protect the seller. But let's think about the standard case for a second. The standard case, even if it may, in some sense, it could harm the seller, but in another case, it actually may benefit the seller. And here is the scenario. The scenario is that I'm a stranger, I'm a foreigner, I want to move into Greenwich. There's a house. Okay, I'm saying house, but we don't know that it applies to homes. But let's, for the fun of it, let's say it applies to homes. I'm not sure. I'm not saying it does, but for the fun of it, let's say it applies to homes. So I want to buy a house in Greenwich. Now the problem is that I know the neighbors would have a built-in right of first refusal, assuming that's the case. So what does that do? So the neighbor now, the foreigner, the guy that's coming in from New York City because of the pandemic. What's he going to do? What's his only protection? His only protection is to pay over market value, right? Because if my neighbor if the neighbor has the rights to get rid of me, but he has to reimburse me what I paid. So if I don't want to be evicted, in other words, if I want the sale to go through, what I should do is I should offer a higher price. And the higher price I offer, the more I'm protecting myself against the neighbor exercising his right of first refusal. Because why would the neighbor want to pay above market value or significantly above market value? So again, I'm not an economist, but just one way to think about it, it's not clear always that in every case this harms the buyer. In some cases, I would think that this actually would help. It's not clear that this will always harm the seller. In some cases, it actually may help the seller because that would incentivize the foreigner, so to speak, to come in and offer a higher bid. So that is just a theory, maybe right, maybe wrong, I don't know. Go ahead, Vicky.
Yeah, that probably explains why we need a buyer to know the market price and then divide it. Because if you just have the right of first refusal, then you cannot benefit from market price adjustment. Right.
And here also, it's very interesting in the Talmud. We'll get to it later, but in the Talmud, in the economy back then, a lot of things had fixed prices. In other words, there was not a lot of great range within prices of commodities because the markets were local and you couldn't really import and export, or you're much more limited. And therefore, people had more of an idea that the markets there was less volatility in the prices, and things tended to have set prices, but not land. Land, the Talmud comes out and says there's no real worth for land. Land is whatever you're willing to pay for it. And they had that understanding of what the modern market understands about pricing. I think that they had that about land. But the point here is that whatever people are paying in this market, if you said there's a right of first refusal, you're going to incentivize the buyer. In other words, you're giving the buyer, the foreign buyer, you're giving that person a right. It's not like we're saying you can't. We're not saying you can never move into town. We're saying is you want to move in to town, and by moving in, you may be harming the neighbor because the neighbor is now, think about the neighbor. The neighbor wanted to buy this land for 80 years. Remember, it's not so easy to move, right? Where people are much more in one place, and they can wait generations before the neighboring parcel goes up for sale, right? So you want to come in, you have the right to come in, but you're in some sense causing damage to the neighbor, which is okay, but you have to pay for it. Pay who? Pay the seller. You see what I'm saying? If you overpay what the neighbor would be willing to pay, then you could move into town, right? So again, if you think about all the pieces of the puzzle and say who wins and who benefits and who loses, I'm not saying that I know because it's too complicated for me and to figure out every scenario, and I'm not an economist, but I'm not sure we can give across the board mark and say that there's one person that's being harmed here, except maybe the foreigner. But I'm saying the seller, I don't know that we're harming the seller. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. In some cases we are, that's clear. And that's why we'll see in those cases we are going to limit this law. So yes, I think it's fair to say that in many cases the seller is going to be harmed, but my argument is I don't think not in all cases. Okay, now I just want to go ahead.
From financial point of view, the neighbor receives free option. This is an option, it costs something. If I happen to be pedestrian in this city, I can say, oh, I'll pay $1 to have right to refusal. So it costs something. He gets this option out of thin air. Somebody is paying for it. Who? And the only answer is the seller.
Could be you're right. I'm not disagreeing, but maybe the person I'm paying for it is the buyer, the foreign buyer. If you're a foreign buyer, no, maybe I don't know. I'm just thinking about this. If you're a foreign buyer, if you're going to buy into town, you're going to be paying more.
Or you don't participate in this. But at the beginning, somebody got an option. Somebody paid for this option. Who paid for it? Not the city. And I'm saying I understand this. Maybe nothing wrong with it because I understand the desire not to have foreigners in the community. But you cannot say that it's a hassle for the seller. He's leaving, he was moving, he would rather prefer.
I agree with you. I would just say that, just to look at it a little, to expand the discussion, the seller is paying for it. Everybody, when you walked into when you got real estate in this town, either from you inherited it or you bought it, it doesn't matter. When this land was divided, everybody got an option. It's not just the neighbor got an option. The seller, before he sold, had an option to his neighbor's lands, right? We have 10 people in the community. We each have options for.
That's a good point. I agree. That makes certainly sense.
Whoever's going to sell first is going to lose, sort of. Whoever's going to sell first is paying for the option, but everybody in town got options to their neighboring lands.
Yeah, they all pay for each other's options at the beginning. That's a good. I agree.
Yeah, but of course, the person selling first is going to lose. But the Talmud is. But we understand that we only sell because we're pressured to sell. In that culture, you don't want to sell real estate. But yeah, but you're getting an option. You're living in town. You're getting certain rights, right? So there's something to that.
It's a deep financial point. I haven't thought about it. You're right. You're absolutely right.
But again, I agree with you that somebody is losing, and in many cases, the seller is going to lose. And you will see here that even the Talmud understands that if the seller is desperate for cash, we'll see there are certain cases where the right doesn't apply if the seller is desperate for cash, which means that this right is slowing down the process, right? That's what it means by definition. So it's slowing it down, which is going to cost the seller. So when Talmud is not coming and saying there's no cost to the seller. That's not fair to say. There's a cost to the seller. The question is we have to balance the cost to the cost to the seller versus the potential loss of this benefit to the neighbors. So we're not saying there's nothing that's cost free, right? You're right. Everybody is going to, there's always a cost. And when the cost is too severe for the Talmud, like I said, it's clear from the Talmud that we understand that it's slowing down the process. It's not as quick to make the sale. It's just limiting the amount of, it's just slowing it down, which is going to be a certain cost. But we're willing to bear that cost. And again, I'm just trying to say that in some cases, not always, the seller wins, right? If a hedge fund guy wants to move from New York to Greenwich and he wants to buy my neighbor's land, and he wants to buy my land, and he wants to buy my property, I'm going to win because that hedge fund guy is going to put my neighbor out of business. He's going to overpay. So my neighbor doesn't get rid of him. So in that sense, the seller wins. In that case, the seller wins. Not always. But every time there's regulation, it slows things down, and that has a certain amount of cost. Agreed.
This argument I don't agree, because there are some cases that seller loses. Somebody would want to doesn't want.
I agree. No, I'm not. I'm all I'm saying is that in some cases buyer wins, sometimes some case buyer loses. That's all I'm saying.
Right.
You mentioned the options point, which is an excellent point because it explains in some sense the theoretical, the philosophical idea, and that's really what the post-Talmudic sort of, when they think about the philosophy of the law, they want to understand what's the definition of the law. And one definition is I have a certain right to my neighbors. In other words, I have an option. I have a right. Other people see it not as a right. So there are different ways of putting it, but the way you put it is beautiful. That when I move in, I get that. I'm buying that option, just by paying taxes in this town, just by being in this town. I'm buying that option, and you're right that the seller may lose, but he has options for his neighbors as well. Okay, so we're done a little over time, but I want to read one more paragraph because this will tell you a paragraph or two. Let's skip the second paragraph because it's going to open up another whole discussion. I want to get in and out with the third paragraph. This practice stems from the charge in Deuteronomy, and you shall do what is just and good. In Hebrew is vasita hayashar vahatov. Do what is just and what is good. It doesn't say do what's right. Just is the wrong word because just sounds like right. Literally, yashar is straightforward. Do what's straightforward and do what's good. In other words, there's a requirement in the Torah to go beyond the obligation. And usually it's just a moral requirement. But this is a case where the Talmud sort of makes a regulation based on this principle of doing what's good. And like I said, it's the exception to the rule. Usually there's the law and there's you want to be good, you want to give charity, wonderful, that's a nice thing to do. This is an exception to the rule where what is considered just and right, what is considered a nice thing to do becomes a right. So it's a sort of an anomaly. It's not the common thing. Our sages said, since the sale is fundamentally the same, in other words, if you're going to plant potatoes, it doesn't really bother you. If you're buying land to plant potatoes, it's really fundamentally the same where you plant it. And that's why, let me just finish. Parenthetically, that's why if the land is different, it doesn't apply. That's why, according to some opinions, if it's a home, it doesn't apply. If one land is superior, it doesn't apply. But essentially, if you're in the agriculture business, you buy acre for acre, how many potatoes this can produce. That's the way people thought about the land for agriculture. So for the buyer, since the sale is fundamentally the same, it is just and good that the property should be acquired by the neighbor instead of a person living further away, because the neighbor is able then to consolidate all of his fields in the same area. And that's a very big benefit when it comes to harvesting the land, working the land and harvesting the land, et cetera, et cetera. Then we get into all kinds of cases. What happens if there are multiple neighbors? The multiple neighbors want to exercise their rights, et cetera, et cetera. And like I said, there's now 2 chapters that are going to limit the rights. But just to put it out there, just to put it out there, this is the notion, this is the principle, and then later we start thinking about how to apply it. And again, we want to sort of, not that we can protect everybody, like Zach says, someone is always paying for it. What we want to do is make sure that the cost on that someone is not too high, and when it is too high, this law, this right is not triggered. So that's it for now. We'll continue this concept in the future. Just a little programming, that the schedule of the classes is going to change next week. We're going to have Tuesday from 10 to 11, we're going to do Kabbalah for beginners, 4 weeks. Jewish law and Talmud, we're going to do on Wednesday from 12 to 1. So I'll email you the information. And we may also do Wednesday morning, the Haftorah. We have 3 more weeks to finish the cycle of the full year of Haftorahs. So we may do two classes on Wednesday just for the next 3 weeks. But look out, hopefully in the next day or two, I will send you the full schedule. So thank you for joining, always appreciated. And have a wonderful day. Thank you.